Hey there, good afternoon, and welcome to Prog Monster. My name is Murph, and I am the host of this show, a show dedicated to progressive rock, hard rock, heavy metal, and other forms of rock music. So it's our Wednesday night favorites, and tonight I'm going to be doing my top 25 favorite hard rock albums. Now, I've had requests to do the heavy metal part, but this seems more of a natural progression to go from progressive to hard rock than to heavy metal. Hard rock is a bit of a difficult genre to do for a number of reasons. It's the same, I guess, for heavy metal, but maybe hard rock might be a little more because it's somewhere in the middle. Often, a lot of hard rock bands, I find, they play some hard rock music, but they also play a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Some of them play this, some of them play that. So it was difficult to decide on what album would qualify as this or qualify as that. So I decided to do a couple things. First, the album had to be majority hard rock, and it also had to be probably about 50% of that majority had to be hard rock. So I'm kind of putting a bit of a cap on it. This is to avoid having albums in here that probably shouldn't be in here because they're more of this or they're more of that. They may have a hard rock element to them. An example of that would be Rush's 2112. Has a lot of hard rock. Some people would say even heavy metal in it, but also has a progressive element in it. And I think the progressive element's a little bit more than the hard rock or the heavy metal element there. So I'm just trying to give you an explanation of how I decided on these 25 albums. And of course, the other limiting factor for me is that there are quite a few albums, and I didn't realize this until I started putting this together, that I didn't have enough familiarity with to actually give them any kind of serious consideration to make this list. Examples: Toys in the Attic or Night in the Ruts, Aerosmith albums. Now, the Aerosmith should be on any top 25 hard rock albums. It just, to me, it seems a no-brainer. They got to be up there. They have some very classic, great albums. But here's the issue with me. Yes, I listened to Aerosmith a lot in the 70s when I was a kid, and in the 80s, more in the 80s, but I never actually owned an Aerosmith album, except for one, which was a greatest hits, and had a little bit of everything from every album, which is nice, but really can't rate an album solely on that, right? So, because I now own Toys in the Attic, but it's just now went on my playlist today, so I really can't consider it for a position on this top 25. There's a few other groups like that too. Alice Cooper, a lot of great albums he has. I've actually listened to a couple of them now, but haven't played them enough to feel comfortable putting them in my top 25 of all time. Come back 2-3 years from now, if I do this again, there might be a lot of them up there. But as is right now, it's pretty hard to give them any kind of consideration when I haven't really listened to them. I wouldn't. To me, if I'm gonna do something like this, I got to be honest. I gotta tell you exactly where I stand with these albums and why they're there where they are. I've got 25 in my list. A few groups have multiple albums. Some have 2 albums, some have more than that. And it only stands to reason because those are the bands I listened to the most and had the most albums of them, and gradually just grew to like them the most. I got 7 honorable mentions. A couple of albums on my honorable mentions probably could have made the top 25, but I don't own them, so haven't listened to them as much as I've heard the entire album, but I just haven't listened to it enough again to be able to make that determination. Okay, so for me, the other limiting factor, as we already know, they have to have had at least 50% of their music on the album had to be hard rock, in my estimation. Some of these albums have maybe a little bit too much leaning towards the pop side, but the songs I liked the best were the hard rock songs, so I included them in the list. Same with some of these albums are borderline being progressive rock albums, and some people may actually think of them as progressive rock albums, but the songs that I like the best are the hard rock songs. So I put them on the list because of that. Are there any other limiting factors that I might consider here? There's none I can think of, but as they come up, I will discuss them. What I'm trying to say basically is that this was maybe one of the toughest lists to do because of the limitational factors as to what classifies as a hard rock album versus, like, the hard rock genre had to deal with whether it's a hard rock or heavy metal, whether it's a hard rock or progressive rock, whether it's hard enough to be hard rock or is it still just basically power pop or pop music. Some of these had ballads on them. Do I disqualify a hard rock because of that? I don't think so. I think if there was a ballad on the album and it was a heavy metal album, that might disqualify it, but not in a hard rock genre. So anyways, and the other factor, of course, is that some of these albums would have been thought as heavy metal albums maybe in the 1970s and 80s, but heavy metal has progressed to such a point now that there's like so many different genres, and some of the heavy metal stuff actually is passed into progressive rock, and some of it has passed in pure metal or death metal and all these other different types of metal, which makes the limiting factor of some of these hard rock albums. An example might be is Heaven and Hell by Black Sabbath. Is that a heavy metal album? I think it is, but maybe the people who listen to some of the modern heavy metal think that that's definitely not heavy metal. So of course all this is limiting factors. So I'm just trying to give you some examples of where my mind is at when I'm deciding on these things. I spent quite a bit of time explaining that. That's how difficult this is. The more difficult part was to arrange these albums in the list according to my favorites, right? Some of these albums have been at the top of my favorites list, for my all-time favorites list, for a long time. There's, of my top 10 favorite albums of all time, 4 of them are represented here. That tells you how impactful hard rock is on my life. I would say it's progressive rock, and then hard rock is right there next to it, and then heavy metal is a bit further down. And then some of the other genres like power pop and blues and rhythm and blues and southern rock, and there's a few other types of music too that I listen to, would be further down even further. So anyways, I hope all this is clear to some of you while I'm doing this list. Of course, if something doesn't make sense to you, please feel free to say it, and I'll try to explain from my perspective. The other thing about these albums is the same as it is about any list album that I rank. There's two things about this. First, these are my favorites. I did not and will not ever say these are the best albums. No matter who you are, these are the best albums of all time, bar none, because that isn't true, because it's all subjectual. The other thing is that a lot of these albums are, I'm going to sneeze, I can feel it. Anyways, a lot of these albums are my favorites right now, because it really, when I'm trying to decide which albums go up and down, it's based on longevity. How have I felt about these albums throughout the past? How do I feel about them now? Is something other than the music impacting it? Things like, did they have an emotional impact at the time? Are they having an emotional impact now? Is something somebody's doing in the band having a negative influence on it now? An example of that, if I was doing heavy metal, would be Judas Priest. Recently Judas Priest was planning a tour and they dropped their guitarist to go with one guitarist, and I think that negatively impacted them. It made me think, oh, what are these guys doing? They've been a 2-guitar band for 50 years, and all of a sudden now they're going to drop their guitar player. To me, it sounded kind of, lack of a better word, cheap. They didn't want to pay the guy, so they dropped them. But then they came back and said they decided they were going to do it because, yeah, they're just putting feelers out to see what's going to happen if they go on tour with 2 or 1. If they could get away with the 1, they would have, because they would have had to pay less money. But I can't see that sounding like Judas Priest when you only got 1 guitar player. And I'm not paying to go see something that doesn't sound like what I always heard it to see. Even if I was to go to concerts, which I don't normally do. But I wouldn't pay for their albums either if they did that. Okay, so I hope a lot of this, like I spent a good chunk of time explaining how I came up with this list and what the limiting factors were and what my criteria was. So I hope it's clear, and if it isn't clear, then you can ask questions. And just remember that these are just my favorites. They don't mean they're the all-time favorites. And there's, again, a lot of albums that I have some in history with, but not a ton of history with. So, and I use the example of Toys in the Attic because it was the one I just finished listening to just before I started this video. And a great album. I can tell right away I'm going to like it a lot, but I just don't have a history with it. Not enough of one to put it up here yet. Maybe in a couple of years. Okay, so we're going to start out with an album I hadn't thought about much until recently when I decided to do this band. And they formed the whole week of episodes. And it was an album that I had not listened to it a lot, but I listened to it recently and I like it quite a bit, enough for it to make number 25. Rock and Roll Machine by Triumph. This is a hard rock album. To me, it's 70%, 80% hard rock. There are some progressive elements here, of course, and there are some slightly poppy elements here and some bluesy elements too, but primarily this is definitely a hard rock album and one of Triumph's best. So they're going to come in at 25, edging out a couple of albums just at the last. It was doing battle with a couple of other albums, and it won out just because it had it didn't have it had more. How do I say it? It had more songs on it that I liked than the other 2 albums. That's basically, it was a numbers game, I guess, if you want. Okay, so coming in at number 24 was an album I first dismissed and decided it wasn't going to be on here. And then I thought, no, it's mostly a hard rock album. Yes, it has a bit of that pop element, and it's very commercial sounding. And it has, the whole pop kind of, I would call it the Def Leppard feel to it, but it's not really a Def Leppard album. I'm never going to go there. It's not in that class, but definitely an album I had eliminated. But then I thought, it just has too many really strong hard rock songs on it. Some of these songs are almost bordering heavy metal. So I'm going to go with, from number 24, it's going to be the 1987 Whitesnake album. This album has at least 3 or 4 classic songs on it, and the best song on it, of course, in the heat of the night. It just slipped my brain. Anyways, it doesn't matter. The album is good enough and hard enough to be a hard rock album. In my opinion, that's its primary feel, and so I'm putting it at number 24. Sorry. I wish I had brought my water, but I think I left it out in the kitchen. Okay, so number 23 is an album who I've been listening to now for about 3 months. So it doesn't have much longevity on it, but has a huge impact. I'd say right now it's probably my favorite album on my playlist. I listen to it a lot. I really like some of the sounds that they have on it. Have I had to give it a label, I would label it as a hard rock album. It has had some grunge sound to it, a little bit of grunge, I think. It has some Indian sounds to it, of course. There's a little bit of a progressive element. The guitar, I wouldn't go as far as to say it's a heavy metal album, but it has a bit of a psychedelic feel to it too, but I think that's primarily the vocalist. So we're talking about The Edge of Twilight by Tea Party. This is a group I started to listen to when they first came out in the 90s. Then for some reason I drifted away, and then I seen this album at a swap shop or whatever you want to call it, and it was $1. I said, you know what, this is a band I've long wanted to get into, and this is $1 I'm paying for it, and one of the best dollars I've spent. This is a great album, Edge of Twilight. Just every song I like. It's got a real heavy element to it. It definitely, that Indian feel to it gives it that almost Zeppelin feel. The vocalist, of course, sounds like Jim Morrison, so it's a real different kind of a pleasing combination of sounds that I just love it. I wished I'd listened to these guys a lot more. I've gotten another one since then, which I'm going to listen to, but I want to give this one a real listen to first before I start confusing myself, which is easy to do. Okay, so on to number 22. From a band that many thought of as a heavy metal band, but I never thought of them that way. They were not a heavy metal band. Maybe their first solo album had a lot of heavy metal elements to it, but to me they are a hard rock, power pop band with a lot of really catchy riffs and beats. So we're talking about number 22 for his Women and Children First by Van Halen. There's also a kind of a bluesy element to them. Van Halen has a lot of little elements to them that are different than a lot of bands. I think David Lee Roth or probably both him and Eddie Van Halen had a real kind of musical love and feel for some real classic sounding music. And it comes through because they put together some stuff that's at that time was very modern, sophisticated, and added these elements. They put them together in their music very well. Also, they're one of the best bands at doing covers of any band out there. And this album doesn't actually have any covers on it, I don't think, and that's the reason why it's up here. It's one of their best. The hard rock songs on this album are the reason why this album is up here. I would say this is an album that's mostly hard rock, and it's a really good album. Like, if you're not listening to this album, gotta listen to it. It's a great album. So there you have it, number 22, Women and Children First by Van Halen. Now, coming in at 21 is an album most people probably have lost to memory, but I remember this album when it came out and the videos that accompanied it. This is a awesome album with a lot of hard rock. Yeah, I wouldn't say bordering on heavy metal, although they did have 3 guitarists, which is not really that common with hard rock bands. This is usually now passing into the element of heavy metal, but they didn't dress or have any kind of style that was heavy metal. There was no real heavy metal anything about them except for their music was hard. And I'm talking about Harder, Faster by April Wine. I Like to Rock. I remember the video for that, and Say Hello. So really, and they did 21st Century Schizoid Man here as well. So it's a really solid album, a really solid hard rock album to me. Little bits of progressive stuff in here as well, but primarily that's what I think of it as a hard rock album. So number 20 is from a band who I've long loved. They were the first band that I ever loved, and they were my favorite band until Kiss supplanted them. And we're talking about BTO, Bachman Turner Overdrive, and this is the Four Wheel Drive album. Four Wheel Drive kind of came out as a result of there being songs left over from their previous album that they hadn't used, so they made a few more songs and quickly came out with Four Wheel Drive. Solid album. Album cover is black and dark. The album is very heavy. A lot of their heaviness comes from the fact that C.F. Turner is such a heavy vocalist, and the band has such heavy guitar playing. Yeah, some solid riffing by this, and this is one of my favorite albums, has been for a long time. So coming in at number 20, Four-Wheel Drive, Bachman Turner Overdrive. Number 19, it was a battle between this album and Four-Wheel Drive, but I guess because I've been listening to this album more in recent times, I had to give some love to this album because it's got some absolutely classic hard rock songs on it. High Voltage from AC/DC, Live Wire, High Voltage. It's a long way to the top if you want to rock and roll. I think TNT is on here too. Yes, like just some real hard rock driving songs. This is a party album if ever there was one, and Bon Scott knocks it out of the park here. Yeah, there's a couple of weak sisters on the album, but they're minor compared to the strengths of the strong album, the strong songs. So number 19, AC/DC's High Voltage. Number 18 is an album that probably would have come almost number one when it came out. There was nothing that compared to this album when it first came out. I loved it, I wanted it, and I didn't necessarily get it for Christmas. I did eventually get it. We're talking about Kiss's Destroyer. Yes, hard rock, definitely. Yeah, it's got its Beth, and it's got a few... there's another Great Expectations, which I have no idea what that is. But at any rate, the rest of the tracks on here are solid. Sweet Pain, Flaming Youth, Shout It Out Loud, Do You Love Me, King of the Nighttime World, Detroit Rock City, and Flaming Youth, of course. Sweet Pain, I think I've probably said all of them by now. Just some real hard grinding songs, and all three of the vocalists on here are at their best. Okay, so we move on up to number 17. This was an album that didn't have a great impact on me when it first came out. People had told me this was a heavy metal group, and I listened to the album and I thought, this is not a heavy metal group. I never thought of them as heavy metal. Yeah, there's a lot of hard rock elements here, and I actually think the album is a hard rock album. It has some poppy songs and some radio poppy songs on it, but pretty much I think it's a hard rock album. I think it's a really good album, and it's grown and grown and grown, and if you'd said, would you like better, this or Destroyer 15 years ago, I would have laughed at you, but not anymore. This is a fantastic album. I've been listening to it now since I got it, so it's been 40 years. And that's Fire of Unknown Origin from Blue Oyster Cult. Just like there's so much variety on this album. And that's primarily because everybody sings. All 5 members sing in Blue Oyster Cult, which is somewhat unique. I don't think there's another band like that. But this album is maybe their heaviest, I think, and has some real Veteran of 1,000 Psychic Wars, heavy metal, The Black and Silver, After Dark, Soul Survivor, Fire of Unknown Origin. The list just goes on. It's just really a really good album. Okay, coming in at number 16, another album that I never had listened to prior to about a year ago. However, I did know some of the tracks because I knew the band, and this album has a lot of their well-known tracks, so I did know some of their stuff. But there's a couple songs on here I didn't know, like Bloodsucker. That was a song that I really love quite a bit, and this album has moved up greatly because of it. It was on my playlist for a long time and just came off short time ago, and just fantastic. So we're talking about In Rock by Deep Purple. This is a band that I had listened to throughout the years, but not really seriously until Perfect Strangers, which was an album somebody gave me, and I listened to that quite a bit, and then went back in the closet for a while. But now In Rock has come out, and I have Machine Head on my current list and another one ready to go. So yeah, a band that's making huge impact for me, and this album is a big impact. It's coming at number 16, In Rock, Deep Purple. Number 15, the debut from this band. maybe it's higher than I'm thinking about it now. It might not. It might not. It probably shouldn't be as high as it is, but there's a bit of a nostalgic feel for it too because it's the debut of this band, and oftentimes when I'm listening to this, I'm thinking about the live versions, and almost all the songs on this album are on the live version. So I think the live version is much better and borders on heavy metal, where this definitely is more of a hard rock pop sound. So we're talking about Kiss's debut album, Kiss. Probably should be maybe down around the 20th spot, but when I was putting it together, I had a bit of a nostalgic feel for it, so I put it up a little higher. The next album out is also a debut album from a band. Probably the same issue here. A bit of a nostalgic feel today, and a lot of great tracks. The harder songs are, of course, the better songs on this album. We're talking about Boston's debut. I think to me, it's a hard rock album, but there's a fair number of pop songs on here as well. So coming up to number 13 is yet another Kiss album. This one moved ahead of Destroyer years ago, and I think it's because it's a raw sound to it. Raw sound, same time, same era, same year even. But the album doesn't have all of that what do they call it, symphonic stuff on it. It doesn't have Bob Ezrin on it. It doesn't have any of that. It's just straight ahead hard rock, and that's Rock and Roll Over by Kiss. And some of it, the Kiss's best hard rock songs, are on this album. Moving up to number 12. This is an album I debated to put it in this genre. It has quite a bit of bluesy feel to it. It has a lot of bluesy. There's a bit of progressive element here and some different noises that you don't normally hear on a hard rock album. But the big tracks, the harder tracks, I think, are the big tracks on the album, I think. And even the bits and pieces of the bluesier tracks are hard too. And I just decided that it's very close to being more than 50% of the album is hard rock. And we're talking about, of course, Heart's debut album, Dreamboat Annie, which was also on my debut list. Very good album. Fantastic. Coming in number 11 is an album that signifies an end of an era, and I wish the singer could have stayed on. I think he would have been one of the greatest rock stars of all time. As it is, he still is, but I think there would have been no question he would have been right at the top. He just had the vocals for it. But it's hard to say what would have happened. This album did really well. Their next album exploded after his death. And yes, we're talking about AC/DC, Highway to Hell. Just one heavy, hard track after another on this album. And the thing about this album I like is that the deeper cuts, the songs you don't hear as much, I'm talking about, the Highway to Hell and some of the more known songs. But the deeper cuts on this album are better, and that's what makes this such a strong album, Highway to Hell, AC/DC. Definitely a hard rock album. I don't think it has enough of a heavy metal element to be put in the heavy metal category. Some of you may disagree. Based on the heavy metal I've been listening to lately, I would say it doesn't. But based on a time period, I might have said it was, Okay, coming right up above it, number 10, another AC/DC, Back in Black, the one that Bon Scott could have had a huge impact on. But to be fair to Brian Johnson, that guy did not drop the ball at all. He socked it out of the park. It's kind of like Gehrig and Babe Ruth here, but it was just a fantastic album. I love it. All the songs on it. My favorite, of course, is Shoot to Thrill, but I know I'll take some heat from the AC/DC fans who think that there's a lot better songs than Shoot to Thrill, and they might be right, but that's my favorite, so that's what I'm sticking with. Anyways, the album is fantastic. Definitely harder than Highway to Hell, but still I still don't think it's a heavy metal album. I still think it falls within the hard rock genre. Has some heavy metal elements to it, though, no doubt about it. The next album up, number 9. This album probably should have finished higher. If it was in a different category, probably would have, but hard rock is one of my favorite elements. There's a lot of really good stuff here. It's the only album from this band up here. In fact, they rarely do really well with their album rankings with me, yet they're one of my very favorite bands, mostly because of the way they are live. And we're talking about The Who, and the album is Who's Next. Got enough of the hard rock stuff on here is the stuff that I think makes this album work and makes it so that I put it in this category. Okay, number 8 just nudged out this album just by a hair, but I think it's their best studio album and it has some of the best hard rock songs for me of all time. Hotter Than Hell, Got to Choose, Strange Ways, Parasite, Mainline, this one hard rock song after another on this album. A real crunching, great album. And, again, in its day, it might have been considered a heavy metal album, but I've never thought of it as a heavy metal album. To me, it's always been a hard rock album. So moving up to number 7. Now, this album, I had one of the most difficulties. I wasn't going to include it, but since I included the other one, I had to include it. I think it's got a lot of different elements to it. It's got a big progressive sound to it. That's the biggest challenge to it. But again, the songs that had the biggest impact on me were the ones that were a little harder rock. And it does have a bit of a pop element to it as well. We're talking about Equinox, or Equinix, if you prefer, from Styx. An album that's recently come out of the wood for me too, because I've listened to it before, but in the last couple of years, it's really taken off, become one of my favorite albums. It's on number 7 here on the hard rock list, so pretty good. There's a bit of a debate whether it's progressive or if it's hard rock. I think it leans a little bit to the hard rock side. That's the side that I like more. Yes, it has Sweet Madam Blue, and that is, of course, one of the great prog songs. But I think the overall feel of the album is of hard rock, so I gave it the hard rock category. It made the list. Coming just above it and just beating it out, but I think it's because this album is just a cruncher. It crunches from top to bottom. It does have a bit of a bluesy element to some songs on the album, but the big songs on the album, led by the crunching vocals of C.F. Turner, and the heavy guitar and bass riffs, and the pulse-pounding riffs of the whole album, not fragile. This album is definitely not fragile. BTO, Bachman Turner Overdrive, coming in at number 6. Number 5, going back to Van Halen here. This album has a fair amount of bluesy sound to it, a little bit of poppy sound to it as well, but the better songs again on this album are the hard rock songs. A couple of them are kind of bordering on metal too, but I think it's hard rock. For me, it's hard rock, and that's Fair Warning, one of my favorite albums of all time. Coming in at number 4, most people are going to be surprised by this, because maybe they don't even think of this album. But it's probably my favorite studio album by this group, and it's only by one member of the group, which is kind of weird. Now people are getting curious, like, where's he going with this? It's basically a solo album by this guy, but it's under their label. That should give it away. We're talking about Ace Frehley's Kiss solo album, or if you like, Ace Frehley's solo album under the Kiss label. That album is one of my favorite. I play it all. I used to play it all the time in the car. Definitely a hard rock, very hard rock. I don't think it's metal, but it's bordering. Like, it's right there at the line. There's enough songs on it that are close to metal that you could get away with using this as a metal album too. But to me, it's a hard rock album, and I'm going to stick with that. So it comes in at number 4. Solo album by Ace Frehley under the Kiss label. Okay, number 3. Long been one of my favorite albums. Of course, comes from the progressive giants, Rush. But I think and there are some progressive elements on this album. There's no doubt about it. It's got some very progressive elements. But I think overall, it's definitely a heavy metal album or a hard rock album. I don't think it's heavy enough to be a heavy metal album, but it also has a lot of that in it too. So it was a very difficult album to kind of put into categories because it has a lot of progressiveness, a lot of heavy metal sounds to it, a lot of hard rock sound to it. It even has some poppy sound to it. But I had to put it here in the hard rock category because I think it came after their debut album, so it automatically is going to sound a little more hard rock than heavy metal. And that's Fly By Night by Rush, one of my very favorite albums. Okay, my top 2 are not just my top 2 hard rock albums, which shows you how important hard rock is to me. They're my top 2 favorite albums, period. They've been my top 2 favorite albums for a while now. They flipped about a couple of years ago, and the number 1 one was number 2 for a while, then it came on and slowly passed other albums to get here. The other one was number 1 for a good 30 years. So we're going to go with the number 2 is Just a Game by Triumph. Definitely a hard rock album. Does have a fair amount of progressive sound to it. And there's a couple songs on here are probably real close to the line with the heavy metal sound too. But it also has a pop feel to it. And some bluesy stuff to it. So it's a kind of an all-around album, but I think that the hard rock element is the dominant element. And it comes in at number 2 on this list of hard rock albums. And the number 1 album I did earlier this week as my look back, and we're talking about Pieces of 8. Some people are going to argue that this is a progressive rock album, and they won't be wrong. It has a huge progressive sound to it. But I think that there's enough hard rock feel in songs like Renegade and Blue Collar Man and Great White Hope. There's enough hard rock feel to it to make this, to me, enough to be a hard rock album, and so I put it at number 1. It's going to be number 1 no matter what list you put it on because it's my favorite album, period. And so there you have it, my top 25 favorite hard rock, mostly hard rock, albums of all time. So I'll give you the countdown back from 1st to 25th, and then the honorable mention. So it's Pieces of 8 from Styx, Just a Game from Triumph coming at number 2. Number 3 is Fly By Night by Rush. Number 4 is Ace Frehley's solo album under the Kiss label. Number 5, Fair Warning by Van Halen. Number 6, Not Fragile by BTO. Number 7, Equinox or Equinox from Styx. Number 8, Hotter Than Hell from Kiss. Number 9, Who's Next by The Who. Number 10, Back in Black by AC/DC. Number 11, Highway to Hell by AC/DC. Number 12, Dreamboat Annie by Heart. Number 13, Rock and Roll Over by Kiss. Number 14, the debut album from Boston. Number 15, the debut album from Kiss. Number 16, In Rock from Deep Purple. Number 17, Fire of Unknown Origin from Blue Oyster Cult, BOC. Number 18, Destroyer from Kiss. Number 19, High Voltage from AC/DC. Number 20, Four Wheel Drive from Bachman Turner Overdrive. Number 21, Harder Faster from April Wine. Number 22, Women and Children First from Van Halen. Number 23, The Edge of Twilight from The Tea Party. Number 24, 1987 album release from Whitesnake. And number 25, Rock and Roll Machine from Triumph. Now the honorable mentions, some of them could have made this list. Creatures of the Night from Kiss. Probably got edged out because there was too many Kiss albums up here already. and Man on a Silver Mountain from Rainbow definitely was right there. Rush's debut album, of course. Jailbreak from Thin Lizzy. Welcome to My Nightmare from Alice Cooper. Blackout from the Scorpions. And Double Vision from Foreigner. The last of which I put on here as a heavy metal album, as a hard rock album, but to be honest with you, it was probably a mistake. It probably should have been under Power Pop or Pop. But it's on here anyways. It didn't make the list, but it did get an honorable mention. So there you have it. Those are my top 25 hard rock songs of all time and the honorable mentions. I'll probably do a top 25 hard rock bands at some time. And then maybe I'll feel comfortable enough to do the heavy metal stuff. We'll see. So anyways, I hope you liked this video. And if you did, please like and subscribe. Give me your top 25. Tell me what you think of my list. And is there albums up here? I know somebody took exception to Miley Cyrus being on one of my lists before. I take some heat. I'll take the heat, though. Just remember, this is just my own personal feelings. It doesn't necessarily reflect what most people might consider to be the best or not the best. Anyways, I hope you have a good night. And from Prog Monster, goodbye.